Well, hello, everybody. How are we doing? If you are tuning in to this stream at this hour on a Saturday night, I would say that makes you a member of the elite. That makes you somebody who is so extraordinarily in the know that you know that the most rollicking good time on a Saturday evening is to tune into this particular live stream and hear me discuss an issue that, like many I cover, has been criminally underreported or underexamined by most of the mainstream press and also even I would say the alternative media because there's not a lot in it for them either to really do a quote deep dive into this story because for reasons that we can get into, but I want to give you an argument as to why it does have major national ramifications. So even if you don't happen to be in New York where this is all going down, even if you're apathetic or ignorant or uninterested in New York state politics, I want to give you an argument for why what has transpired in the state government and what took another very ominous turn recently, why that should keenly interest you, why you should be following it fairly diligently. Okay. So, as I'm sure many of you remember, Governor Andrew Cuomo, who had been in power for over 10 years, was summarily forced from office this past August after the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, released a report that claimed and purported to document that Cuomo had sexually harassed 11 women, and this caused Cuomo's political support, at least among the professional class in New York State, to evaporate almost overnight. He was called on to resign by everybody who could be potentially consulted in the matter, including Joe Biden himself. And so he did resign, but that wasn't the end of the story. And if you followed my coverage of this matter back over the summer, you'll know that I presented some angles on this that really had not been remarked on at all in most of the media, including, for example, the fact that Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, stood before TV cameras as she was announcing that this report was being released and summarizing its contents. She went before a TV camera and just decreed that Cuomo had committed multiple violations of state and federal law. Okay, so maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But what Letitia James did in that context was virtually unprecedented. I cannot find a relevant precedent for a state attorney general in a public venue just proclaiming that a citizen, governor or not, any citizen, had committed multiple violations of state and federal law, and then washed her hands of any responsibility to actually prove those allegations in court. Meaning, Letitia James now, given this precedent that was set against Cuomo, could get on TV, get before the cameras, and just declare that you, I, or anybody, if you're in the state of New York, committed violations of the law. And then her theory is she has then no attendant obligation to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you committed those legal violations. Or if it's a civil violation, prove to beyond a preponderance of doubt. She just declared it. And nobody seemingly, other than me, and maybe a very, very tiny handful of others, noticed that this was a gigantic abridgment of a foundational tenet of due process, right? A prosecutor can't just run around declaring you guilty of violating the law and just let that allegation float in the ether and not prove it. They have to prove it. They have to prove it in a court. They have to prove it with due process. And Letitia James just totally abdicated any responsibility to do that because, well, there are many reasons why that could potentially have been, including political calculations, which we'll get into. Okay, but Cuomo left office in August. I raised some doubts about the veracity of the allegations in this report that had been basically ignored by the media, meaning the deficiencies of the report had been ignored. One of which, the most blockbuster of which that I came up with, and I did some cursory investigation into this, but I didn't have the resources to do a full scale investigation. But what I found out, and which you can go read in my archives on Substack from August, is that the victim, the Cuomo victim, who I would contend was the most significant accuser, Charlotte Bennett, who has now sadly blocked me on Twitter rather than respond to my request for comment, either through her or her lawyer, by the way. Charlotte Bennett, who was victim number 2 who came out, right? So why is that the most significant victim? Because it gives the impression that there is a snowball effect. Where there's smoke, there's fire. Wow, more women are coming out of the woodworks. Well, that was Charlotte Bennett's role in this Cuomo saga. And she came out as victim number 2 and declared, among other things, that Cuomo had, quote, groomed her as a 24 or 25-year-old professional adult political operative working in the governor's mansion in Albany. I mean, that alone should have strained credulity, you would think, where she's appropriating this concept of grooming, which tends to be what you refer to when an adult illicitly predates upon a minor child. But anyway, Charlotte Bennett used that term to describe her purported experience with Cuomo, and therefore became victim number 1 and just got totally, kid glove treatment from the media, where they all essentially converted into her press agents, where they were just vehicles for her claims and didn't bother scrutinizing or challenging anything or even doing basic fact finding. So I did that, and turns out that Charlotte Bennett, not long before she got embroiled in this Cuomo issue, had been involved in litigation or had been named in a lawsuit against her alma mater, Hamilton College, which is a small liberal arts college in upstate New York. And in this lawsuit, it was alleged that she coordinated a eerily similar campaign as the one that she helped coordinate against Cuomo, but then it was against a fellow male student at Hamilton College. And Charlotte Bennett accused the male student of sexual impropriety. And wouldn't you know it, but Charlotte Bennett then subsequently, later on, had to withdraw the allegation against the male student on the grounds that new information had come out, which proved that she fabricated her allegation against this male student. So let me just sum it up. What Charlotte Bennett was named as doing or cited as doing in this lawsuit was fabricating an allegation of sexual impropriety against a male student with the intent of ousting him from the campus, which she achieved. The student was ousted. But then it later came out, based on contradictory evidence, that she had fabricated that allegation, and she had to withdraw her accusation against this male student. She's never disputed this. I tried to get her to comment on it. She hasn't commented. The settlement, the lawsuit against Hamilton College brought by the male student was confidentially settled. Okay. And so Charlotte Bennett, to my knowledge, has never commented on this issue, even though it would directly impugn her credibility as relates to another episode where she's also coordinating allegations against a male figure whom she wants ousted. Okay. But that was ignored by the media. It's confirmed The veracity of what I reported has been 100% confirmed. It's in the court documents. It's in the record. Go look at the Substack. But even Cuomo's own attorneys seemingly did not know about this at the time. And yet, what happened? Well, New York media, after I reported this, and after it got a bit of circulation back in August when Cuomo was on his way out, they exploded. They accused me of being a shameful recipient of Oppo research from the Cuomo operation. Now, I hadn't talked to anybody from the Cuomo operation. They didn't even know themselves, apparently, that this lawsuit against that implicated Charlotte Bennett even existed. And yet the New York media, and this is all chronicled in my latest Substack, it's in the description box, please read. This was all, but yet the New York press corps was so certain that they just had an outburst on Twitter where one after the next, they were all accusing me of just being like a witless stooge for Cuomo, as though I had any involvement with them whatsoever, which I didn't. I got this information about the lawsuit totally independently and had nothing to do with Cuomo or any of his staff. But that they overreacted in such a way and lashed out at me rather than dealing with the substance was telling. And it was telling because I think ultimately, when all the chips have fallen, there is going to be, by necessity, if anybody's honest, which they probably aren't, if they have any fidelity to basic notions of reality and facts and fairness, they will have to acknowledge that the media facilitating this story, this Cuomo story, is just an embarrassment because it could not be, it's more full of holes than Swiss cheese, to use a kind of low IQ metaphor, but it's apt. I mean, it's so full of holes that it's like Swiss cheese, but then blown up with dynamite. Okay. And it should be said, I never approached this story because I had any political affinity with Cuomo. I mean, actually quite the opposite. Go look back in my archive at Vice, at the Daily Beast, I believe, and elsewhere, where I had reported very critically on Cuomo in the past on a whole range of subjects, including on Twitter and so on. So this wasn't about somehow wanting to rush to his defense because I was a huge fan politically. It's because if I'm a fan of anything, it's of some basic weddedness to factual reality rather than just throwing our hands up in the air and saying that, the ends always justify the means if the sleaziest of means succeed in getting rid of a political figure that we don't like. Because it has wider societal implications. It's not about Cuomo alone. It's about what happens when you have a narrative that's coordinated and orchestrated like this, and how it sets a precedent that governs or could govern the rest of society. So that happened all last August, right? And I had prophesied or predicted that there would come a time when the media who abetted this narrative would have to admit fault or reevaluate or reassess. And something very curious happened within the past week and a half or so, which is that Letitia James, the Attorney General who presided over this Cuomo investigation, and when the authorization was given to her to conduct the investigation to Cuomo, she had assented to a stipulation or a condition that the investigation will be conducted by independent attorneys, an independent law firm, right? So she was not to be involved because of a conflict of interest. Well, what was her conflict of interest? It was that she was going to run for governor, okay? She was planning to run for governor. She could therefore be Cuomo's political adversary. She would be running against him in a Democratic primary in New York in 2022. Therefore, of course, it would be a gigantic conflict for her to be using the law enforcement powers of the state government to investigate her primary political rival, right? You'd think so, but more and more evidence has now mounted that maybe doesn't prove, but at least strongly suggests to the point where she should be asked about it when she's not really being, that she is deploying the powers of the state, the law enforcement powers of the state. So not just any power, the judicial system, expressly to advance her own political ambitions. And she did so by neutralizing her main opponent, Cuomo, which she did. I mean, her report had the effect of doing that, forced him out of office, and made it so that he was, seemingly cannot run in the next gubernatorial election in 2022, which he would have been favored to win. And she has no compunction about using the law enforcement powers at her disposal to advance her electoral ambitions. Now, that might be among the most nefarious traits that an elected official can have, because it's not just about everybody who's in elected office, if they're trying to stay in power, is going to maneuver in such a way that maximizes their likelihood to stay in power, right? But it's another thing entirely when you are controlling the law enforcement apparatus, right, which is supposed to be steadfastly neutral, and it's not supposed to have any regard for anybody's political ambitions, and yet it's used under her jurisdiction specifically to remove her chief political opponent. And then what happens? Well, 2 weeks ago, or roughly a week and a half ago, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a leak comes that Letitia James will be imminently announcing her run for governor, which had been speculated before. She was not hiding that she was preparing to run for governor, but the rumor leak came out that her announcement will be imminent, right? So this was on the 27th of October. That leak occurred, right? On the 28th, what happens? Well, there's another leak, this time from Albany, showing that a criminal complaint had been filed against Cuomo for forcible touching. And this involved one of the flagship accuser in Letitia James's report, Brittany Commisso, who says that Cuomo groped her in his office. He says that's a fabrication. So within hours of the first leak that James was going to imminently announce her gubernatorial run comes this second leak that this charge had been filed. Now, the filing of the charge seemingly took everyone by surprise. The sheriff of Albany County, whose office filed the charge, said that he didn't know the leak was going to come out. The attorneys for Cuomo didn't know that the charge was going to be filed. And you know who also didn't know? Commisso, the purported victim. Whoever filed and leaked the criminal complaint against Cuomo actually circumvented the victim, Commisso, and released it in disregard for an understanding that Commisso's lawyers said had been brokered with the district attorney, that only upon her informed consent would charges be filed, because if charges are filed, then she's going to be scrutinized and potentially could expose herself to legal liability if she's shown to have not been truthful, right? So she came as a surprise to the victim, came as a surprise to the DA, the district attorney of Albany County, which would be the figure that would actually be prosecuting Cuomo. That's the prosecuting entity. The DA was circumvented. And in August, the sheriff whose office filed this complaint, Sheriff Craig Apple, who is not responding to my request for comment, revealingly enough, he said in August that if the sheriff could not get the agreement of the DA to proceed on charges and could not cooperate or coordinate with the DA, that would moot the entire attempt to prosecute Cuomo. And yet he moves forward without the cooperation or agreement of the DA, thereby doing exactly what he said would moot his entire investigation. Okay, so nobody seems to be aware that this is coming. And yet Letitia James, within hours of leaking that she plans to run for governor and is going to announce imminently, She has a statement ready to go proclaiming that the filing of the criminal charge against Cuomo validates her report. And therefore, this was not part of her statement, but it was strongly implied that therefore that undergirds her gubernatorial campaign and it shows that she's the people's lawyer or something. Well, I'm going to explain why this is so troubling and why you ought to care about this, even if you are not a New York resident, even if you're apathetic, even if the governor of New York doesn't interest you. And I'm going to do that now on Rockfin, which is linked to in the description box, which you should click now, and then I will continue.